Now I want to go into a report that came out on the Inflation Reduction Act and basically how good has it been for climate change since it was passed. So this comes from an organization, I think they're called the Climate Monitor or something like that. This group of scientists, of researchers, put out projections for what the Inflation Reduction Act would mean for electric vehicles and what it would mean for clean energy electricity generation after the bill was passed in 2022. Now, after 1.5 years, they looked back at the actual data, how many electric cars have been sold, how much new capacity has been installed, and they tested it against their initial projections to see if they're up to par. The results are mixed, okay? So the gist is that we're on track with solar, batteries, and EVs, but we're behind on wind power. So let's start with EVs, okay? Sales of 1.43 million zero-emissions vehicles constituted 9.2% of all light vehicle sales in 2023.
That's way better than 2022.
Yes. In 2022 was about 6.5%. So in this 9.2 was at the top end of the post-IRA projected range that these researchers put in, okay? But it's also about 3 times the amount projected in 2020 before the IRA was passed.
Gotcha.
So like clearly the IRA has had a huge effect on the growth rate of electric vehicles taking over the market.
Yeah.
Now, growth is expected to fall in 2024 because there are going to be some headwinds on pricing. As Tesla's forward guidance says that they don't expect blockbuster in 2024, but that the growth rate could be even higher in 2025 and onwards. But even though the growth is expected to fall in 24, it's not expected to fall below levels that earlier projections had it.
Yeah, I mean, like the main reason a lot of these industries are falling, right, or consumption and demand for these industries is falling is because of high interest rates. These are very, very impacted. Demand for these products, whether it be solar, whether it be, your EV, whether it be utility, renewable generation, all that is very, very contingent on the cost of borrowing.
Yes,
so when cost of borrowing is high, it's gonna slow demand on these types.
I'm not sure it's demand, but it's price. So it drives up the cost of building them, obviously, and that drives up the price.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Just to be clear. So that's where we're at on EVs. We're up to par. Then in terms of producing electricity, right? In 2023, 32.3 gigawatts of renewable energy production and storage capacity were added. 18.4 gigawatts of that was solar. So we're killing it with solar, okay? 6.4 gigawatts for batteries, which is also far above what the projections were at the beginning. 6.3 gigawatts for wind, okay?
That's depressing.
It is depressing. So solar is expanding rapidly. Batteries kind of work really well with solar because you have these very typical cycles with solar, right? All the sun during the day, and then at night you don't have any, but people come home from work at night and there's an electricity usage spike that happens when they get home. Batteries are huge for carrying over that solar that was generated during the day through that evening spike.
Right.
Okay. But while solar is expanding, batteries are expanding. Wind is down in absolute terms since 2021. We installed much more wind in 2021 than in 2022 than in 2023.
Damn.
Okay, and wind is also likely to miss the capacity it needs to hit to get back on track by 2024. So this is not good news. This is bad news in our transition. So the question is why, right? Why is wind doing worse than the projections said? There are 2 takes here that I've heard and that I like, okay? One is based just on physics. So the best geographies for onshore wind are these low, flat areas like the Great Plains in the Midwest, for instance. But these tend to be far from the large population centers. Obviously, we have Chicago in the Midwest, but otherwise, most of our populations live on the coasts. Right? So when you're generating the electricity that far from the population centers, what you need is a ton of transmission, and we don't have a ton of transmission, right? So we need to be able to build out this infrastructure to be able to actually get the wind power to the people who want to use it.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know in Texas they're seeing a lot of success with wind power, right? Because but those wind farms that are being built in those plains are way closer to population centers.
Yes, Texas is kind of like the one. Texas is an example of the easy place
Yeah.
to build the wind, or like you can build them in Oklahoma and then transit to Texas. But across most of the Midwest,
Right.
you're not close to anything.
Right.
And so this is like the IRA has effectively reduced the costs of wind to make it more than competitive with fossil fuel energy generation. But if the infrastructure isn't there to make it possible,
Right.
it's still not going to happen. So now, in my opinion, there's going to be an IRA 2.0 that comes out at some point.
If the Democrats win the Senate and the House and
Or-
keep the presidency.
Yeah, or keep the presidency at least.
Yeah.
It needs to focus very specifically on transmission, on funding transmission build out, and on permitting reform to make sure that can happen extremely quickly. The other take that I want to talk about is in regards to supply chains. So solar manufacturing, as we've talked about many times, completely dominated by China. On the other hand, manufacturing for wind turbines is still largely done in the West. And that's the case because we can get these solar components from China really cheaply because it's easy to ship them. But with wind power, we're using such enormous parts that it actually is a big deal to try to ship wind turbine parts overseas and get them to build here.
That's one of those things, like you're like thinking about, shipping something is difficult because of the size. It's like, you don't really think about that anymore.
No.
You really, I feel like, I don't know, my interpretation of like solutions to modern problems is like, I don't know, get a bigger boat. Like, I don't even.
No, exactly. Everything can get everywhere easily.
Yeah.
But these are actually big enough that
That's things you take for granted.
Yeah, totally. So it makes sense. So they're built near where they're actually installed for that reason. And so when COVID hit, China kept its manufacturing going pretty much all like completely ramped up. China's worried about people getting too idle and creating social instability because they're not doing anything. So they've been all in on manufacturing. They've been all in on exports for as long as we can remember, right? Like since they've been a modern economy. So they never slowed down their production of solar parts, but the West did very much slow down and temporarily pause their production of wind parts. And so wind has never gotten completely back online. That's why wind now, building it out, is harder and it's somewhat more expensive than it otherwise would be. That's something, fortunately, that should just dissipate with time, I think. But I think the transmission issue is going to be a really big deal. And this wasn't even including offshore wind. We've talked about offshore wind on the show and how it's been hurt really badly by rising interest rates. But there are other things that are holding off offshore wind. It's the reason we're not really talking about it now is these early projections didn't even expect a build out of offshore wind.
No way, really.
So it doesn't really hurt, at least not by this point. So it doesn't actually take us down on our expectations.
Do you think
we
know if offshore wind was added to our onshore wind numbers from this report that it would equal the projection? Do we know that or no?
These projections still do include offshore wind.
Oh, they do?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So that doesn't really help. It just so little was built this year that it doesn't really move the needle.
Okay.
Yeah.
And 2024, I don't expect much more to be built either.
No. I mean, we can be hopeful if... no, in 2024, because what we need is interest rate cuts.
Right.
To then create a downstream bigger build out. So
and like we might get a cut in March, but maybe end of March. So they need to if the CPI report on March 15th is good, but then we'll see if the inflation rate, if our interest rates start getting cut in early March, maybe it's possible it gets better.
And even then, the cuts are going to be relatively small. We need multiple cuts, which we will get eventually, I think.
Yeah. Some experts are saying that it could be 3 cuts in 2024.
Yeah.
Which would be good for everybody.
Yes.
Especially since like it's not a scenario where like our economy could go into recession if we don't get a rate cut, but like we're definitely missing out on multiple economic multipliers if we don't.
Yeah, totally.
Right now.
Yeah, no, I mean, right now is the biggest, especially in terms of climate change, we need these rate cuts. The one other thing I will say about offshore wind, even though it's not really specific to this current event, it has been stalled for other supply chain reasons because offshore wind needs these extremely unique specialized vessels to build it.
Whoa.
Right? Well, because you have to take all of the wind stuff off and you have to kind of build these little undersea platforms to be able to build the
Yes.
the turbines.
Right, and there's a limited number of those ships even available.
Extremely limited, and there's also a law on the books in the U.S. called the Jones Act.
Yes.
That prevents you from using internationally like crewed and assigned like I don't know shipping well enough. I don't know the terms.
I know, but it definitely needs a U.S. crew.
It needs a U.S. crew, and it needs to be like a U.S. built ship.
Yeah,
is the thing. And so the U.S. companies haven't been in the business of building one of these specialized offshore wind vessels, right? Which means they have to use these workaround processes to be able to use the few international vessels that do exist for it.
Yeah.
So repeal the Jones Act. That's just a little side tangent.
Repeal the Jones Act.
Yeah, that's where we're at via the IRA.